This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired police chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. So welcome to a Way Forward podcast. My guest today is Leah Albright-Byrd. Leah has faithfully served her community as an advocate, direct service provider, and leader in the nonprofit sector for the last 18 years. In 2011, Leah founded and directed a California-based nonprofit that provided an array of services to child and adult survivors of human trafficking. While leading that effort, she became a national and international advocate for the cause, promoted legislative change, and appeared on various media outlets to promote public awareness. She eventually received a congressional honor for her activism efforts, but due to an experience with major burnout, made a decision to focus her energy on uplifting leaders, which she does now, among many other things. Leah possesses a bachelor's degree in psychology and theology from William Jessup University and coaching certificates from Western Seminary. Welcome to A Way Forward, Miss Leah.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
So I wanted to start with a story that I heard you tell when we were on a panel a couple of years ago. And before we get to that, I grew up in Oak Park at the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue, which is right off of Broadway, which the whole time I was growing up was a spot where young girls and young women were trafficked pretty much 24 hours a day in front of our house, along with some drug dealing. And what I commonly heard outside of my home from people other than my mother was that this was a victimless crime.
Right.
A lot of hate or disgust or dislike towards the girls.
Right.
But I lived in a home where my mom was the exact opposite. She said, this is absolutely not a victimless crime. These young ladies are the victims of this crime. And she's really the only person I ever knew growing up that felt that way and always tried to help the women in front of our house. She's also some of those people that would march up and down Broadway with signs against the Johns and the pimps and things like that. And so I as a police chief, especially when I was in Roseville, there's a couple of large churches and several large organizations that have really taken on human trafficking. But one of the things I would hear people commonly say is that children would get kidnapped from the mall.
Right.
That everybody in trafficking, or the vast majority, were taken from other countries. The problem with that is I've never seen a case in my law enforcement career where that somebody was kidnapped from the mall, including the mall in Roseville, and never once had a case of that. I know some girls are taken from other countries, but all the people I've worked with and become friends with or known over the years, none of them were from other countries. Mm-hmm. So if you would tell your story when you were 14, and also how the police department plays into that story, because I think that would be important for people to understand.
Sure. And I feel inclined to respond to what you just shared before
Absolutely.
we get into that, just because I think what I've concluded is that the kidnapping narrative is easier for people to digest, I think, when they lack education around the issue. So it's easier for a person to understand or comprehend a child being trafficked when they think of that child being forced against its will. And it's a little harder to understand the vulnerabilities that would cause a child to be taken advantage of by an adult, and sometimes even by another young person, right. Psychologically manipulated and coerced into horrific things, right? I think it's a little harder for people to understand. And that's
why I think you're so important on this, because if we think the whole issue is being kidnapped from the mall,
Right.
then our response is different, and it won't really truly make an impact on young girls' lives, because that's not actually how it's typically happening.
Exactly. And I think it can become an obstacle to empathy too, if we're not careful. I think, I've heard people, especially, unfortunately within communities of color, there seems to be at times in lower income communities of color, a little bit less empathy because of some of the socialization around the issue. So if you're exposed like you were to that kind of environment regularly, and then you're hearing people spout information that isn't a full picture, it's inaccurate, then you'll become desensitized and it'll be harder for you to empathize. So there's a tremendous need for education. And that's why I think the voices of people with lived experience have been elevated across our nation and in other parts of the world, because people really need to hear from those who've walked a mile in those shoes and really understand it. And I think, it's interesting that that's where your context is. And my initial experience with being trafficked happened on Stockton Boulevard, and at certain parts of Stockton Boulevard were in Oak Park, right? So like I'm familiar with that community. And the story that you referenced is actually, it's interesting because it's a story that ties into the very first day that I was trafficked, which I think is it's really significant for people to hear and understand. And I want to preface what I'm about to say by acknowledging the fact that law enforcement has evolved significantly since then. Some of my closest allies and friends are cops, detectives, FBI agents, people that I would have been afraid of and wanted to stay away from at one point in my life because I was on the other side, right?
Right.
So I don't want this to be a story that bashes law enforcement. It's more so just giving people historical insight to where we were versus where we are now. And so that particular day, it was about 100 degrees. It was the middle of summer in 1998.
And how old were you?
I was 14.
Yeah.
And I was out there with another young lady who was also being trafficked. And it was her first experience, just as mine. And I know that because she's the girl that I ran away from home with. And we both had really colorful, layered traumas that we came from, and we were vulnerable. We ran away from home, and that vulnerability and that risk, because youth that run away are at risk. That risk put us in a position where individuals who had horrible intentions had access to us, and those individuals put us on that street that day. And it was daytime, and a police car pulled up, and there were two gentlemen in the front seat, two cops, and they pulled up and they said, "Are you guys hookers?" Now, that was my first time. That was the introduction to me to the stigma that people that have experienced the commercial sex industry encounter. I mean, I had no idea that I was going to have that experience. I didn't know that police officers could say things like that to people. I mean, I'm completely green as can be, 14.
And very young.
Yes, right.
Which is why you were green.
Right, exactly. And so we're not going to say, yes, we are, because we know that puts us in a position where they'll take us to jail. Because we know that much. We've been groomed up until that point to understand, at least basically how to interact with law enforcement so that we couldn't get arrested, and that reduced the likelihood of the traffickers getting caught, right? Is that if they could from us, then they could protect themselves. And so when the gentleman asked if we were hookers, and I said no, I remember saying, no, we're not, because we're not going to agree to that. And his response was, well, you guys look like you are. And they started laughing, and they rolled the windows up, and they drove off. And anytime I've shared that story, I've shared it because now I have the opportunity to reflect and go, wow, that could have been such a crucial point of intervention for me. And what that did was it solidified in my mind what the traffickers had had expressed to me, and that I couldn't trust law enforcement, would not be a source of support for me. And I had many other experiences as time progressed that reaffirmed that narrative that day. Just got
and the narrative of like officers that maybe who knows what they could have done, but they didn't even really try, it sounds like.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Well, and I think they suffered under that lack of education too, right? It's like,
right.
if you see this as a victimless crime, which is what they saw it as in that time, you're not empathizing with the average age of entry. You're not even aware of the average age of entry for prostituted people in our country, which is about 11 to 14 years old in our country.
Which is just, well, any age is pretty horrific, but to think of, somebody at that vulnerable of an age being put into that environment is crazy. And I think people need to know that's what goes on in this country, not in some other country, not in a third world country, but in our very communities that we live in all across this country. This sort of thing is happening.
Right. And, and my bonus daughter is 12. She'll be 13 this year. And I look at her sometimes and I see the innocence and the complete oblivion to the reality of how dark the world can be. And that is every child's reality. I mean, children, in my case, I had been exposed to a lot because of, having a father who was impacted by the crack epidemic. And so were so many of my aunts and uncles. And I had witnessed domestic violence. So I had already had traumas that increased the vulnerability in my life. But that does not mean that I had this like insidious idea that I was going to go out and prostitute myself and make money. And I think that's the perception that some people have, is it's like, well, they're money hungry and they're just out there because they want to be out there. And it's like, I was terrified.
Well, movies don't help.
Yeah.
Movies kind of glorify. Now, you mentioned about childhood traumas and vulnerabilities. For the folks listening to the podcast, you've done a lot of work in the I guess area of human trafficking, which is just awesome all in it of itself. But in your experience, what are some of the more common kind of things that led girls into the world of human trafficking? Because I think there's a lot of misperceptions about that, as opposed to I got kidnapped at the mall kind of narrative.
Right, exactly. Well, I think what immediately comes to mind in response to that question is an organization based in New York called GEMS, ran by a friend and colleague of mine, Rachel Lloyd, and it's one of the nation's oldest anti-trafficking organizations that serve this population. But what they did was create this continuum, this what we call a commercial sexual exploitation continuum for children, that to really help people understand what happens. And there's this sort of convergence of factors. Like when you look at a lot of victims of human trafficking and survivors of human trafficking, about 70 to 80% of them have a history of sexual abuse. So if you already have a history of being sexually abused, you've already linked sex and abuse in your mind.
Right.
And so then you have, a global multi-billion-dollar industry that profits off of the exploitation of women and children and men. And so you have that socialization, that demand out there for commercial sex. And you have an incredibly vulnerable youth that in many cases has experienced multiple traumas that are untreated, right? I always say that all youth are vulnerable, but there's like varying levels of vulnerability. I've seen girls from 2-parent homes, middle-class families in high school or in middle school. I've seen them become victims of human trafficking, just like I've seen your lower income 1-parent home child with myriad traumas become victims of human trafficking.
I think that's important for people to know, right? Like, I think most people think that the the kids that get involved in trafficking are from the hood, come from dysfunctional families solely, have all these other issues, or kidnapped at the mall kind of thing, as opposed to, on the outside anyway, looks like pretty intact family, both parents, and you're saying you've seen all of the above.
I have. I will say that lower income communities and communities of color are at the highest risk. However, I mean, when you have a child who's on social media and maybe unsupervised and going through, let's just create a case study, an example. Let's say you have a 13-year-old girl who's going through hormonal changes. So she's already dealing with things internally because of puberty. And she's dealing with bullying at school. She's got two parents that love her, but she just doesn't feel like she fits in. And she's on social media, but she's unsupervised. And that happens a lot. I mean, when social media, when the internet, not social media, when the internet first became a thing, I was like 11.
You're scaring me right now because I have two daughters that are 18 and 16.
Yeah, see, America Online was a thing, and our parents were really cautious about it then. And I think we've all gotten so accustomed to social media that it's really easy for children to have a lot more freedom. And as a result, predators have more access to them. I just went through, one of my bonus kids, their TikTok page, because I'm looking at the privacy settings and immediately I'm going, too many people have access to this.
Right.
But your average person doesn't necessarily think about those things. And I admire the ability to not have to think about that stuff.
Right.
But I think none of us can afford to just ignore that reality. And so back to that example, you have this 13-year-old girl, hormonal, being bullied, two-parent home. She's on social media and somebody approaches her, follows her on social media. She has no idea who this person is. He's cute though, and he's saying things to her that are making her feel good about herself. And next thing you know, he's asking her if he can meet her. And we call this in the human trafficking movement, we call this Romeo tactic, right? Like it's like where you're going to woo and win this girl romantically. So there's no big bad wolf there at first glance. Right. But how does a 13-year-old know that? She doesn't, right? And so then next thing you know, she agrees to meet him, and he's talking to her, and and there's a number of ways that people can end up in these situations. But I think that's the piece of information that the general public really needs to understand. We have to understand how vulnerable children are developmentally, psychologically. They are vulnerable, and they're meant to be protected by adults, but there are adults that will take that vulnerability and use it to their advantage.
As working in law enforcement for the last 34 years, it always scared me to death to go down to the detectives that worked cases like this, that would go online, right? They'd show me, hey, you want to see how it goes, Chief? And they'd log on as a 13-year-old boy or girl. And the number of people within seconds that would be reaching out was always astounding to me. And it didn't matter what time, what day. It was just insane how just sitting there watching this play out, obviously in an environment where it's a detective doing it, not an actual 13-year-old girl. So a minute ago you mentioned, I don't remember the exact term you used, but maybe a little bit more at risk if you live in an impoverished neighborhood for some of these risks. So, neighborhoods in Sacramento like Oak Park or Meadowview or Del Paso Heights, there's communities, impoverished pockets of poverty in every city across our country, oftentimes high minority population that eventually, has crime associated with those neighborhoods. So somebody with your experience in serving others for so many years and being involved in many different efforts that serve other people and try to help lift other people up, what do you think we as a society should be thinking about to change the dynamics in these communities that have been in this position of poverty for decades and decades? Because, as a history buff myself, as an adult looking into history, I found that these communities weren't always like that.
Right.
They weren't always impoverished. And for the first time as an adult, I thought, well, if we weren't always impoverished, then we don't always have to be impoverished. When growing up in Oak Park, I just always assumed Oak Park was like that. So I never thought Oak Park could be any different than that. I had a blast growing up in Oak Park. I don't at any second regret growing up there. I had it was great. But I never thought it could change because I just thought it was always like that. So with somebody with your experience in serving others and lifting others up, what do you think as a society we need to be thinking about or doing to help lift up these communities that, as you said, can tend to be more challenging for young kids grow up to not get involved in, things that have the potential, obviously, to destroy your life and definitely take away dreams?
Such a
or not even cultivate dreams in the first place.
Right. That part, that pervasive sense of hopelessness, or there only being a few ways out, right? Like playing sports or being a rapper or something.
Right.
And it's interesting because my significant other has a very similar narrative to mine, but his way out was through his athleticism. He was that 1% that went to the NFL, but he still has all these family members and people that are still suffering and struggling in those same cycles. I've come to look at human trafficking and a number of other issues within these underserved communities through the lens of public health and health equity. I see human trafficking as a public health issue. Now, I didn't have that lens initially, but I think the longer that I've been doing the work and the more upstream I got, because that's where I was drawn to. It was like when I was in Sacramento and I was running the organization that was fighting human trafficking, about 80% of our girls were of African-American descent. And it was disturbing to me. It was like, okay, why are those with a historical narrative of having been trafficked to this country now at higher risk for being trafficked in this country? What's happening, right? And so once I started doing some of the policy work, I realized, yes, we need organizations that are on the ground doing grassroots efforts to bring, restoration and recovery to those who have been impacted. But we also need that upstream work where policies are changed and we use the power of the vote to transform communities. And I think there's just a tremendous need for ongoing education at large, right? Like I just spoke at a church in Temecula in Southern California. And I talked to that community, that church community, about looking at this issue through a public health lens and really helping them understand what all these different factors are that contribute to community transformation. We can't look at a community that is impoverished and underserved and go, okay, you didn't get there by yourself, but fix yourself.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. We also can't just have people from outside of the community coming in trying to fix the community. There's this like massive strategic intentional effort that needs to happen, and it includes policies and laws changing. It includes people from within the community being empowered to transform their own community. It includes people from outside of the community, people that don't look just like the people within the community. I mean, I think we saw this with the civil rights movement. We saw this with MLK. He talked about the strength to love, and he said that the answer to the issue then was proximity. We had to do life together to help each other, to understand, to be able to empathize, and to be able to, vote and volunteer, devote ourselves and our lives to seeing these communities transformed. There's no simple answer, but I personally am no longer intimidated by the magnitude of the issue. I look at this now as legacy work. I'll share this, and then I know you've got another few questions, but I got invited to a activist retreat in 2019, and I got to meet this incredible woman, Flonzie Brown Wright. You'll have to look her up. She marched with MLK. She's instrumental in voter registration in the state of Mississippi, which that is significant in and of itself, with her being in her 80s now, right?
Right.
Flonzie Brown Wright. And, I asked her when I had the opportunity to, I mean, you don't get these kinds of opportunities, right? I had the opportunity to ask some questions. And one of those questions was, how did you guys stay motivated with the
Right.
amount of oppression and pressure and trauma and all the stuff that they were navigating that I can't even fathom? I read about it, it makes me upset, right? She
Even
looked
within their own community.
right,
Right.
right.
Well, Martin Luther King talked about that a lot.
Exactly. And she looked at me and just as simply, she said, "That's easy, baby. We knew you were coming."
Wow.
There was
That's motivation right there.
right. There was
Right.
their intention was to do legacy work that outlived them.
Right.
This is not going to get fixed in our lifetime, but we have an obligation. I feel like I have an obligation, right, to make sure that I make my mark, just like those that have gone before me have made theirs. And that's how we transform communities over time.
I'm so glad you said that, because I've always believed that, like, too many people want to take the credit themselves, want it done so quickly. And so they, and I always thought, as a police chief, I believed we could get there, but I knew we wouldn't get there in my time. Right. So my job was to get it as far as we could and hand it off to the next person that might do it a little differently, but still had the goal of getting to where we don't have these pockets of people that we leave behind and just continue to suffer. So my last question on human trafficking for you is, and you mentioned this earlier, that law enforcement has changed somewhat since the time that you referred to on Stockton Boulevard, when they just basically rolled up the window, laughed, and drove away. And a lot of that is from people like yourself that have educated, and you mentioned this earlier also, education, have educated officers and the communities. And so now we work with organizations like City of Refuge and groups like that, and the girls don't necessarily go to juvenile hall or jail, that these groups are there with the officers and are able to more holistically help these young ladies that are going through all the things that you mentioned earlier. So that's a good thing. There's still a long ways to go. It still happens way too frequently. So there's obviously still a long ways to go. But for anybody listening to this that wants to help in any way they can, what would you say is the best way for them to help in the world of human trafficking, to help save lives and dreams and those sort of things?
I'd be remiss not to continue on and give that shout out to City of Refuge in Sacramento. I'm sure there's listeners all over the country and even, beyond, but in Sacramento, California, City of Refuge, Sacramento has been serving within the Oak Park community and serving various vulnerable groups for years now. And I think sometimes people are not sure of where to invest both their resources and also, their time resources, their financial resources. People are unsure, and I can attest to the power of the work that I've seen happen there at City of Refuge, Sacramento. I think that depending on where a person is and how deeply they desire to be involved, right? Like, it's like, I'd say there's a number of ways to get involved. I think, for one, on a basic level, be an informed voter.
Yeah, there's that.
Make sure that you educate yourself and vote, right? Like, if there's an opportunity to transform a community with a vote, do it. And don't just do it haphazardly. Take the time to really educate yourself. I'd also say philanthropy is important. I think sometimes people think, well, if I'm going to give to a nonprofit, I need to give thousands of dollars. That little $20 check, and I can tell you from running organizations, that consistent $10 check, just imagine 1,000 of those people coming together to give to a cause. My grandmother, when she passed away in 2017, and she had a very limited budget. She passed away, and I found in her paperwork, because she made me the executor of her will, I found all these little checks that she had written to all these nonprofits that she supported, and she sent those out every month.
Wow.
And she was 87 on a fixed income.
Right,
So
right.
I
So if
think
she can do it.
yeah, if she can do it, anybody can do it. And I ran an almost entirely volunteer-led organization, and I cannot tell you how powerful it is to see people show up and volunteer their time. Everybody may not have the aptitude or the stomach to work directly with a victim of human trafficking, but there are nonprofit organizations that really need support in other ways. I mean, it's stuffing envelopes, it's doing administrative support. We used to have someone who would do transportation for us, and she was retired, and she didn't necessarily want to have a mentorship relationship, but she was willing to give a girl a ride somewhere. And when you think of a person with a newborn child that's overcoming trafficking trauma, catching a bus in the rain, that that drive to an appointment is significant.
Right.
So I think that's important. The vote, the giving of your time and your treasure is
Awesome.
imperative to change this issue.
So I want to get to what you're doing now.
Okay.
And you're currently the executive director of Health Movement. Tell us a little bit what that is, what you do, and what's the purpose behind it.
Great. I'm glad I get to talk about this. It's interesting how, and I know you can attest to this, how your career, it's almost like it unfolds before you. You don't necessarily always know where that path will lead you, but
you didn't pick that path, it picked you.
No. And so I was really at a place where I knew I wanted to pivot, but I didn't know what that pivot looked like. And as a person who came from an underserved community and started a nonprofit in service to an underserved community, I knew all too well the struggle of leadership in that space, because becoming, being a philanthropist or running a philanthropic effort, right? Like all of those things as a social entrepreneur require skill and development. And so that was a passion of mine. And then, as I've already mentioned, I was really interested in what does community transformation look like? And so when I found out about this opportunity, it was an organization that basically married both of those passions. So the focus is on health equity, but it's also on empowering leaders that are advancing health equity. And so for the listeners that don't know, health equity is essentially about everybody having the opportunity to be as healthy as possible. So when we talk about these underserved communities and COVID-19, what did COVID do? It showed us, it highlighted the disparities, right? And it is very difficult to be healthy in a food desert. It's difficult to be healthy when you're struggling to pay your rent. It's difficult to be healthy when you've got generational traumas that are untreated. And so health equity, it looks at all of that. We call them the social determinants of health.
And why should we all be concerned about that? Not just the people that are victims or involved in the lack of health equity, but why should everybody be involved in that or concerned about that? I
think that, MLK, he said it best. He said, what affects one affects all of us. I mean, I want to be careful when I say this because it's just an example. I don't want this to be an overgeneralization, but I'm a middle-class person now. Mm-hmm. And I live in a community where I want to feel safe, but I live in a community that might be targeted by someone who might want to do a home invasion. Right. I mean, I do, so I have different things to think about now. And because of that, not that it's just entirely self-serving, but it's like, what if that person that goes and does the home invasion is a 16-year-old boy? Right. And I'm standing here with a gun because I live in Texas. Right. Ready to defend myself. Right. And it's like, I'm now affected by something that's happening in another part of my community. And I can either be a part of the solution, or I can go, it's not my problem. Right. And I think if we really genuinely care about human beings in general, it shouldn't take, oh, well, I've been affected by crime to want to care. Right. I mean, the reality is these are people, and people that are impacted by a number of factors that are not always their fault. This is not, I think sometimes some people look at it and go, well, Now, I pick myself up by my bootstraps, and they can go pick themselves up by their bootstraps.
I hear that a lot.
And it's so frustrating, right? Like, you know, I remember my uncle Tommy, and he's deceased now. He passed in 2011, but he was a heroin user, and he grew up with a domestically violent father. My grandfather, his mother, my grandmother was the victim of rape. My grandfather raped her at 13 and started having babies with her. And you know, by the time my uncle was in his 50s, his body had been significantly impacted by his substance use, and he did not have the best kind of healthcare. Right. And he went into in a hospital and was repeatedly denied care until he finally came back and had a massive heart attack in the emergency room because a bleeding ulcer ruptured. And the next thing you know, he was brain dead. So health equity is not just about healthcare, but hospitals all over our nation are waking up to the fact that it's like, okay, 18% of our gross national product is spent on healthcare, and yet we're not healthy.
Right. Right.
So what does it look like to get healthy? Well, to get healthier, we have to address some of these other issues. So now you have hospitals going out with, you know, hospitals, nonprofit hospitals have a community benefit requirement where they have to invest those dollars back into the community. So they're partnering with other nonprofits to address some of these issues and to make our communities safer. I live in Dallas. South Dallas is one of those underserved communities, and the nearest grocery store is a 3-hour round trip bus ride away, but the liquor store is right
wow.
there.
Oh, yeah, there's always a liquor store. Yes. I lived right across the street from a liquor store.
Right. So health equity is the cause that I'm focused on in this season, but the strategy is to support the leaders that are doing the work, because I know what it's like to be in leadership, to have a cause, and to not have the strategic insight to know how to accelerate your vision or to sustain and develop nonprofits. I think sometimes people look at charitable work and they go, oh, you know, they've got the money. This fundraising thing, developing these organizations, building these institutions and advancing these missions, this is not easy. People give their lives to it. So I have a group of retired executives older than my parents that work for me, that go out in service to the community, and they're retired. And now they go and they counsel and support these leaders that are advancing health equity with strategy and transformational insights to help the communities change.
That's great. Well, I just want to say, you know, from the story we started this podcast today, where officers pulled up to you and your friend and basically didn't do anything. From that, you've in your own life have evolved and grown to now you do exactly what we probably all would have hoped those officers did for you, for other people. And what I really want to stress to people listening is that you don't have to be rich. You don't have to have, you said it so well just a minute ago, special insight or experience with anything. You know, I mentioned my mom earlier. The house I grew up in, my mom's house, she gave away for free, and the city of Refuge uses it, Cash uses it. And literally the room I grew up in, my bedroom, is used when needed to house women escaping the trafficking world. And my mom we weren't poor, but we definitely weren't wealthy. And just that simple act, my mom died in 2018, and yet what she did is still serving other people. So I'm so thankful that, one, you got out of that world, and not only that, but have become such a light and help to so many other people, that it's just awesome knowing you, the perseverance you've had. I always call it overcomers. You are definitely an overcomer that has now given life to other people. So last question I want to ask you, for your current role as executive director in all what you just talked about, if somebody wanted to help in that realm, in health equity, and help your organization specifically and any other organizations that you're a part of, how would they do that? I don't want to leave this podcast without having that opportunity that somebody that maybe you inspired, which I'm sure there'll be many with your story and your life, that they don't have something they can do, right? To outlet to how do they help if they've been inspired to help in the area of health equity?
Thank you. Thank you. Before I share that, I just want to respond really quickly to what you shared about your mom, because I'm grateful for her. I'm grateful that she raised a powerful Black man to go out into this world and transform it. And that's what you're doing. And I'm grateful that you invited me to be a part of this podcast. And how beautiful is it that room is now used in the capacity that it's used for. I just love stories like that.
It's interesting that you said that, because I learned that from a young girl who was actually literally living in the room in my bedroom.
Wow.
At City of Refuge. That's where I met her, at City of Refuge for a community event. I ran into her just by happenstance. Rochelle introduced me to the girl, and she looked like she saw a ghost when she found out that that was my house. And she literally, I described the room to a T to her, and she's like, "How do you know that?" And I'm like, "That was my bedroom." Wow. And I actually didn't know my mom had given that house I knew she gave the house away, but I didn't know it was being used for that purpose. So after that, I called my mom on the phone and I told her this whole story, and she goes, "Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I knew the house was." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know you knew." She goes, "Why do you think I gave the Hagstroms that house?" And so but she's just a normal person every day. Nobody, if you lived outside of Oak Park, you'd never know my mom's name. She's never on TV. She's never, seeking any of that. She just did what she could every day. And I'm sure it's saved many lives, just the same as you do. So again, how can people help with what you do?
Yeah, I love that lighting up your corner. I think lighting up this corner would look like going to healthmovementinc.org and checking out the services that we offer. We are accepting donations. That would be tremendously helpful in service to our work. But I also want to revisit City of Refuge Sacramento, just because we don't provide direct services. We're working with the leaders that are serving the communities, and that's an important part of the work. But for those that are interested in the direct service element, where the people are actually going and doing interventions with vulnerable populations, City of Refuge, SAC, is a great organization to invest in or to volunteer with.
And they are trying to build a new building to provide even more services and housing as we speak, so they could definitely use it.
Yeah. Yes, they are. Yeah.
Well, Leah, it has definitely been my pleasure. It's good seeing you. I haven't seen your face in a while. It's great to see you, and I'm so glad and thankful that you're doing so well, and good luck with everything that you do in the community. You are definitely a bright light for so many people, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.